Here we go for part 3 of lecture 4, and we're continuing to explore McDougall, and we're definitely getting groupy. We're definitely knee-deep in social psychology at this point. So does McDougall have in place for crowd psychology? Well, a couple observations that simpler emotions are going to be seen to spread more easily. So if we want to influence a group, if we're Mussolini and we're trying to turn Italians into fascists, if we're Hitler and we're trying to turn the German people into supporting the Nazi regime, anger and fear are going to work a lot more easily than shame or jealousy. Shame is a self-referencing emotion, so it requires a sense of self and a lot of cognition around that. Jealousy is a very intellectual emotion when you get right down to it, because it takes the analysis of who has what and who's entitled to what, and then jealousy results out of that process if we feel there's been some kind of violation there. Anger and fear much more easily done, right? So a couple of features were identified for the phenomenon. The stimuli should have a common relevance to participants. So in Germany, in 1930s Germany, it's like, hey, we're in a depression, life sucks, we have no money, inflation is rampant. And it's the Jew, it's the communist, it's the Jew, right? So very, very common relevance. This affects us all, right? It affects us all. We inject into people a diminished sense of responsibility, that this is not our fault, that it's somebody else's fault, the target fault, right? Increased suggestibility, so that people are more open to the influence. Rashness of thought, not action. We want people to react. We don't want them to engage in critical thinking, because that's just going to mess up the process. And fickleness. And we see that people in this state are often fickle. They will respond to this, that, or the other thing, if you will. That's a line from Gilligan's Island, spoken to him by a dictator. Promise them this, that, and the other thing. And the fickle people will buy into that, so they just move from topic to topic, right? So as long as there's a central theme. Now, so this collective emotion, group mind, McDougall's 5 conditions, it's better if the group has some sense of longevity, so you want to, in fact, get them together and keep them together. The awareness of the group purpose, and a single purpose, obviously, as we described, would be better. Interaction with other groups to the extent that it facilitates the process, and this can be negative interaction towards outgroups or positive interaction to similar groups. Shared values of the members, so create a set of values and get people to buy into them and share them. And then clearly defined roles for the members, and this is a very effective strategy. What is my part in this transformation, or what we're going to do? And notice the Nazis used a very simple system of block captains. So you take a block of people, that is a city block, let's say, and you designate someone as the block captain, and that becomes their role. And then other people are given the role to observe and report to the block captain, or to suit up and go out and kick ass, or whatever it is. So everyone needs a job, a role, right? Some aspect, something for them to perform. Attention to these conditions facilitates one's ability to organize and manage the group mind. So these are things we should be ever vigilant for, whatever our society is, because this is easily done again and again and again. Now, we're going to transition to the interactionist par excellence. We're going to transition to Kurt Lewin, and what do we know about Dr. Lewin? He had a tremendous bent for an interactionist philosophy. He came out of the Gestalt tradition, and Gestalt psychologists really had, well, more than this, but 2 major contributions. Let's keep it simple. One is sensation and perception, and the Gestalt psychologists were intrigued by the issue. Hey, look, I got eyes, I got nose, I got, hearing, I got all these different sensory systems, and they feed to different parts of the brain for different perceptual processes, but my experience of the world comes to me as a whole, not, oh, I see this, oh, I smell that these are all integrated. That is the Gestalt, is the integration, kind of the final product. And also then when we look at Gestalt in terms of kind of understanding how people think and how they experience their world. And for a therapeutic intervention, the Gestalt is kind of the person's life space. It's their overarching theory and experience of their world. Well, Lewin comes out of this tradition, this Gestalt approach, and it's in response to the evolutionary and instinct-based theories. And Lewin's going to be a lot more about learning. He comes from a different area. He comes from physics, right, rather than biology. And notice that most psychologists, most philosophers, all the way back to Hippocrates, are talking in terms of biology. Well, Lewin's coming from a whole different point of view, and that's what makes it kind of so refreshing and so fascinating, that he talks about this in terms of physics. That is, forces, consistent forces and opposing forces that act on the being or are produced by the being. Right? So he develops what's called field theory. And it doesn't rest on a set of individual properties. Rather, it's the organization and the parts of the whole field. So that's the Gestalt, is represented by the whole field, its entirety. Analysis needs to be conducted at the level of the whole if you want to understand. And notice, while many people are reducing, Lewin is often operating in the opposite direction by combining. It aligns well with the nascent field of social psychology, and he is one of the really kind of founding fathers of modern day social psychology. My advisor, Marilyn Brewer, always quoted Lewin. She was a big fan of Lewin, and she said, "There's nothing as important as a good theory for organizing thought." And notice that theory is the big view. It's the Gestalt view. So it organizes our experience of our world. So this theory is an organizing framework to rigorous scientific investigation is all important. That is, we can make these small little hypotheses that are empirically verifiable in the laboratory, but what does it all mean? That is, what is the big picture? And that's where the theory comes in. So Lewin's scientific approach, right, and an experimental investigation of needs, action, emotions cannot be carried out with taking into account the characteristics of the person, his momentary state, and his psychological environment. So core psychological categories then to attend to explain, to understand, and to predict behavior. And remember, those really are kind of the three core components of psychology: is to explain, to understand, to predict, right? So how do we do that most successfully according to Lewin? Well, we look at a person and there's 5 core characteristics, right? There's emotions, there's their sensation and perceptions, and notice that our sensory apparatus differ, are variable, as our perceptual experience of those sensations. The action in which we're embedded and or taking, will, and he acknowledges will, maybe synonymous with desire, if you will, and then the cognitive contents of thought process, which can include memory. So, right, if you want to understand then the life space of an individual, according to Lewin, right, you have the person of the boundary, and inside us is this thing called needs, right? And then we have driving forces that represent part of the field, our life space, right? This is our life space, and these driving forces interact with us as the individual, cause needs, and then, but there's a goal, so we want to achieve. This is the driving force, we want to achieve the goal, but notice there's often intervening or barrier forces that prevent us from reaching our goal, that we have to figure out, we have to circumvent, we have to bust through, right? It might be other people's desires that thwart our desires. It might be a lack of skill in performing a certain action. But to understand what a person's going to do in a given situation requires an understanding of all these components. So this is very much embedded or inspired by physics. That is, if we roll a ball, can we estimate how fast that ball will roll? Well, it depends. What's the nature of the incline? What is the surface friction of the ball to the surface of the incline? What is the air pressure, right? What are all the forces, the gravity, all these forces, right? To understand what a person's going to do and how they're going to get it done requires an understanding of the environment in which they're operating, and also the environment, the internal environment of the person. That's their perceptions, their memories, their current thoughts, etc. So it leads for a very complex kind of view of human nature, and it's super social psychological, because social psychologists don't discard information about the person, the individual. Lewin's saying we have to factor that in to the context of the situation as well, combine all those, and it enhances our ability to understand and predict. So for Lewin, it's ever the interaction, right? Emotional activity is best understood by the interaction of the individual and the environment in a particular life situation at a given time. So again, time, that fourth dimension, as I'm suggesting, is all important throughout this course, but what is the given situation, right? And what is the nature of the environment in which we're embedded, and what is the individual brought to that kind of party? So, relatively complex, but it's reducible to a simple formula. And this is a physics-style formula, right? So this is where B is a function of FPE. And what does this mean? Well, behavior, and that's usually what we're interested in explaining, is a behavior, right? An observable behavior, or to predict a behavior. It's going to be a function of the person and their environment, and that's where the simplicity comes in. Now, the person, as I described, is a complex set of constructs like memory, perception, thoughts, etc., all that, desires, needs, drives, motivations, all that. But then within the environment, and the environment can facilitate all of those aspects of the person, or it can inhibit those aspects, or it might inhibit some and facilitate others. So we understand the complexity. Behavior must be studied relational form, not in its reduction to constituent components, because the component pieces don't explain anything to us other than some tiny aspect that contributes to the behavior. Well, Lewin is saying, we want to look at the big thing. So if we want to predict how is someone going to react, right? That is, what emotion might we see in this person in the next minute? Well, we have to understand the aspects of the person. We have to understand their history, their current state, but then we have to understand the effects of the environment at them in this moment in time. And notice, at this moment in time, the effects of the environment might be vastly different on this person than a different moment of time. We're probably not the same person when we wake up in the morning as we are as we're preparing for bed, right? Or midday. So time, all important. So we're not going to abandon reductionism in its entirety. Lewin believes that the analysis must be conducted holistically, but can be reduced to units of action. So let's think about predicting the behaviors and the feelings that exist. For example, you want to entertain guests. Well, entertaining guests is kind of, the goal. That's the big picture. What do we want to do? We want to entertain guests. What's this going to require, though? And this is where we reduce into the constituent components. Inviting guests, right? Okay. Well, that means we have to call them to invite them, or text them, or what have. We have to somehow contact or make the invitation obvious to the guests. We have to then proceed to the meeting location, whether it's our home or someplace that we've invited them to. When we get there, and if it was a lunch, right, we have to order lunch. We're going to eat lunch. We're going to decide who pays for lunch, and then we're going to depart the event. So entertaining guests is a large process, a relatively complex process that can be reduced to components. If we want to explain how a person's going to do any of these components and what their emotional response to doing them will be, then in fact we unpack it into these kind of reduced units. Right? So units of action then, emotions are tied to units of action. Calling to invite. God, I hate the telephone. It makes me anxious to speak on the phone, right? So if we want to understand the big picture, inviting guests, we invite guests because we want to have a good time, and we're ultimately going to leave having a pleasant experience. But notice within, there may be, in fact, individual units of action that lead to smaller chunks of emotional activity, like the anxiety of perhaps an invitation, or what if they turn me down, right? Going to the meeting location. Oh my God, what if I get lost and I'm going to be late, right? So we can see all these different emotional elements that arise out of these reduced pieces of action. So it's tied to these units of action, operate alongside units of action, but the emotions are separate constructs, right? They arise from the units of action. They are not the units of action. So emotion then can be conceptualized as a layer. It's a core psychological component of behavior, right? But separate from the actions themselves, although still connected. Unfortunately, much of this line of thinking was severely interrupted by the Nazis and approaching World War II. And yes, Lewin was a German Jew, and as so many contributors to psychology at this point in time were in Germany, were of Jewish ancestry or faith, however you want to put that, and they were all bound to, in fact, be sent to concentration camps unless they got in line. And what famous philosopher kind of towed the line with the Nazis? And that's Heidegger. Basically got in line in the university system with the Nazis and kind of maintained his setting there as a German philosopher, not a Jew, obviously, and that's kind of Heidegger's legacy or curse, if you will. So let's move out of this then. Lewin and photography, at least in my humble opinion, right? A photograph freezes the temporal dimension of a stimuli, right? And this then can also potentially truncate, reduce the field or the extent of the field. Because, and I love this photograph, because when we look at this photograph, what we're looking at then is an amazing photograph. I mean, taken as it is, just at face value. Man, that woman is holding that guy up, and it looks impossible for her to hold that guy up. How is she strong enough to do that? How can she do that with a single arm? How can all this happen? But then, you know, reality sets in, and when we say, well, this guy has probably been in motion, all right? So he probably started here, and he's going there, and so again, I find photography fascinating, because the field that we need, that Lewin suggests we need to understand what's going on here, we have really no conception of what these people are about, what their background is, what their training is, what their ability is, what their motivation is. These are all aspects we need to understand the situation, right? Or perhaps predict what's going to happen next, right? So the photograph freezes time, and it kind of destroys the notion of field theory. Also notice that physically the field, where did he come from? Where is he going? Is that happening at all? Right? We can't see the ground that she's standing. We can't see basically anything. So I think it's fascinating when we look at photography that kind of just decompensates the whole process of field theory. So, but it remains dependent on the temporal dimension of the photographer and the viewer. So when we view this photograph, as Lewin would suggest, we bring to our viewing of this photograph all our core individual components. And we're viewing it at a given time. That is, we're viewing it within a field. So that our response to this photograph is largely that combination. So while the photograph cheats us out of the field and the Gestalt, so to speak, our participation with the photograph is a demonstration of it. And that's kind of pretty ironic to me. So what provides meaning if we want to understand? Well, we need to understand the motives necessarily of the photographer, but certainly the motives of the viewer and the state of the viewer who's observing it. Regardless, we've gone a long way. We've kind of shed the philosophical underpinnings at the beginning. We kind of said, we've had enough philosophy this semester for this course, so now we're going to move on, and we're going to begin to embrace these psychologists. And as promised, this is the social psychology of emotion, so I will continue to take, most often continue to take a social psychological bent to our exploration of emotion. That's it for part 3. We're building the path, and sometimes we got to stop work because the path floods or whatever else happens in our environment. So, Penelope, you going to say goodbye? Not so much? All right, I will say goodbye. You guys have a great day.